There's a phenomenon Jung observed throughout his clinical work that contradicts everything popular psychology tells you about empathetic people. We've been sold this romanticized version of the empath as someone whose capacity for feeling others' pain is limitless, almost sacred, but what Jung discovered in his practice was far more unsettling and far more human. He noticed a pattern emerging across different patients, different backgrounds, different life circumstances. The individuals who possessed the most refined emotional attunement, who could read unspoken pain with eerie accuracy, who seemed to carry an almost supernatural ability to absorb and process others' suffering, these same people would sometimes undergo a transformation so complete it appeared they'd become entirely different humans. The warmth vanished. The concern evaporated. What remained was something cold, unreachable, almost frightening in its detachment. Most observers dismissed this as hypocrisy or hidden narcissism finally revealing itself. Jung saw something else entirely. He recognized this wasn't character failure or moral weakness. It was the psyche's emergency response to a threat most people never acknowledge exists. The empath hadn't become cold because they were secretly cruel all along. They'd become cold because their psychological survival demanded it. What makes this particularly significant in Jung's framework is how it connects to his broader understanding of psychological balance and the principle he called enantiodromia. This Greek term describes how everything eventually converts into its opposite when pushed to an extreme. The person who feels everything will inevitably swing toward feeling nothing when that extreme becomes unsustainable. This transformation isn't random emotional volatility. It's the unconscious mind executing a precise protective protocol that's been encoded in human psychology for millennia. When the conscious personality becomes too one-sided, when any psychological function gets pushed beyond sustainable limits, the unconscious intervenes with what Jung termed a compensatory mechanism. The psyche literally forces balance through its opposite. In his therapeutic work, Jung encountered individuals who had spent years, sometimes decades, operating as emotional processing centers for everyone around them. They absorbed their family's dysfunction, their friends' crises, their colleagues' stress, their partner's unprocessed trauma. This became their identity, their value, their purpose, and beneath conscious awareness, something was accumulating. Jung used the metaphor of a vessel filling drop by drop. Each instance of emotional absorption, each time the empath prioritized someone else's pain over their own well-being, each moment they suppressed their needs to accommodate others' demands, these accumulated as what Jung called shadow material in the unconscious. The conscious mind could ignore this accumulation, but the unconscious was keeping an exact accounting. Then would come what appeared to be a minor trigger, a friend's casual dismissal, a family member's entitled demand, a colleague's thoughtless comment. But this trigger was the final drop that caused the vessel to overflow. The empath didn't break down in tears or explode in anger. Instead, something switched off. The emotional circuitry that had been running constantly simply shut down. What Jung observed in these moments fascinated him because it revealed the autonomous nature of the unconscious. The person experiencing this transformation often felt as confused by it as everyone around them. They hadn't decided to become cold. The unconscious had taken control and implemented its emergency protocol, and the conscious ego could only watch as the personality reorganized itself around this new frozen center. The scientific foundation Jung built around this phenomenon connects to his revolutionary understanding of psychic energy. He recognized that libido isn't just sexual energy, but the totality of psychological life force. This energy operates according to principles similar to physical energy. It cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed and redirected. When an empath continuously channels their psychological energy outward, they create what Jung termed an energetic imbalance within their own system. The conscious mind might ignore this imbalance, might even take pride in its capacity for endless giving. But the unconscious recognizes the danger. At a certain threshold, the unconscious executes a forced shutdown of all outward emotional expenditure. Every available unit of psychic energy gets redirected inward, locked down for internal repair and reconstitution. This explains why the coldness feels so absolute. It's not a conscious choice to be slightly less available. It's an autonomous protective mechanism that operates with the crude efficiency of any emergency response. The empath's psychological shutdown follows the same logic as the body going into shock after trauma. Jung documented cases where this transformation completely altered someone's social position and relationships. The person who had been the emotional center suddenly became peripheral, isolated, seemingly indifferent, and the response from others revealed something Jung found equally telling. The anger and accusations of betrayal showed how many people had been unconsciously dependent on the empath's emotional labor. Very few people responded with concern for the empath's well-being. Instead, they reacted with panic about losing access to a resource they'd come to expect. The complaints weren't, "I'm worried about you," but rather, "Why won't you help me anymore?" The shift had exposed the extractive nature of relationships everyone had believed were reciprocal. Jung's concept of projection becomes relevant here. The people surrounding the empath had projected their own capacity for emotional processing onto this convenient receptacle. They'd outsourced their psychological work. When that person suddenly became unavailable, they had to confront the uncomfortable reality that they'd been avoiding their own emotional development. Jung's work on psychological types provides another critical lens for understanding this transformation. Empaths typically have highly developed feeling functions. They navigate the world primarily through emotional perception. But Jung emphasized that every function has its opposite, its inferior counterpart, that remains undeveloped in the unconscious. For the empath, the inferior function is often thinking, cold, rational, detached analysis. When the empath reaches their breaking point, we're witnessing the sudden emergence of their inferior thinking function, erupting from the unconscious with primitive, unrefined force. This explains why the coldness feels so extreme. The empath isn't accessing mature, rational detachment. They're being overtaken by raw, undifferentiated thinking energy. It's all or nothing, and the unconscious has chosen nothing. Jung's clinical observations revealed something most modern psychology overlooks. The empath's transformation isn't pathological in itself. It's the psyche's attempt at healing from what is essentially chronic psychological trauma. Every time an empath absorbs someone else's emotional pain without proper boundaries, they're experiencing vicarious traumatization. The coldness represents the psyche implementing a quarantine protocol to prevent further contamination. What makes this particularly relevant is recognizing the warning signs before reaching the crisis point. Jung emphasized that consciousness, genuine self-awareness, was the key to preventing these extreme swings. The empath who remains unconscious of their accumulating shadow material will inevitably experience the violent pendulum swing to coldness. But the individual who brings awareness to the process can potentially integrate both poles without losing themselves to either extreme. This integration work requires confronting the uncomfortable truth that your empathy might have been serving functions beyond pure compassion. Maybe it made you feel needed, valuable, even superior. Maybe it allowed you to avoid dealing with your own pain by staying perpetually focused on others' suffering. Jung called this psychological projection. We often become obsessed with healing in others what we cannot face in ourselves. The empath who turns cold is unconsciously performing what Jung termed a sacrifice. They're killing off the persona of endless compassion because it has become a prison rather than authentic self-expression. This sacrifice is necessary for psychological development, but it's terrifying because it means destroying an identity that brought social approval and personal meaning. The coldness forces you to discover an answer that doesn't depend on others' needs defining your worth. The deeper pattern Jung identified connects to his understanding of the collective unconscious and archetypal energies. The empath who turns cold is enacting the ancient archetype of the wounded healer, the one who must first experience their own psychological death and darkness before they can offer authentic healing to others. The coldness is the descent, the necessary journey through psychological death. Jung's warning becomes most urgent here. If the empath doesn't recognize what's happening and work to integrate the experience consciously, they risk becoming stuck in the cold phase permanently. The protective mechanism that was meant to be temporary becomes a new identity, a new prison. They transform from the person who felt too much into the person who feels too little, and neither extreme represents psychological wholeness. What I find most striking in Jung's observations is how relationships respond to this transformation. People who are dependent on the empath's emotional labor often react with shock, anger, even accusation. These reactions reveal the hidden dynamics that were always present, but never acknowledged. The empath was being used, even if everyone involved was unconscious of the exploitation. Jung made a crucial distinction between genuine reciprocal relationships and what he called psychic vampirism, relationships where one person consistently drains another's psychological energy without equivalent exchange. The empath's coldness serves as a brutal but necessary revelation of which relationships were authentic and which were extractive. The psychological mechanism Jung identified operates on principles similar to physical immunity. Just as the body develops antibodies after exposure to pathogens, the psyche develops psychological antibodies after repeated emotional violation. The coldness is the immune response, harsh, indiscriminate, but ultimately protective. Throughout human history and across all cultures, we find myths and stories of the compassionate figure who retreats into coldness after being betrayed or exhausted by human cruelty. The empath's transformation taps into this ancient pattern, which is why it feels both personal and strangely familiar, as if enacting a story that's been told countless times before. Jung's research into alchemy provided him with a powerful metaphor. The alchemist spoke of the nigredo, the blackening stage where the prima materia must be broken down completely before reconstitution in a higher form. The empath's coldness is their nigredo, their necessary dissolution of an old identity before authentic rebirth becomes possible. Let me walk you through 3 contemporary manifestations of this Jungian pattern to show you how this plays out in modern life. First scenario, the corporate empath who becomes ruthlessly strategic. Consider someone who spent years as the emotional glue of their workplace. They're the one everyone comes to with problems, the mediator in conflicts, the person who stays late to help struggling colleagues. They've built their professional identity around being caring and people-focused, but they're chronically exhausted, increasingly resentful, watching less empathetic colleagues get promoted while they're valued but never advanced. One day, something breaks. The transformation is startling. Suddenly they're cold, calculating, focused solely on their own advancement. They stop volunteering for extra work, stop mediating conflicts, stop being emotionally available. People are shocked. But what's really happened is enantiodromia. The psyche has swung from excessive feeling to raw, undeveloped thinking. They start making decisions purely based on strategic advantage, networking only with people who can advance their career. It looks like they've become narcissistic, but they're enacting Jung's compensatory mechanism, the unconscious demanding balance after years of one-sided emotional labor. The tragedy is that this person hasn't found integration. They've just swung to the opposite extreme. True psychological health would involve maintaining appropriate boundaries while retaining the capacity for genuine connection. But reaching that balance requires conscious work most people never undertake. Second scenario, the relationship empath who ghosts their entire social circle. Picture someone who has always been the friend everyone depends on. 3 a.m. crisis? They answer. Need free therapy disguised as friendship? They provide it endlessly. They've internalized the identity of the good friend, the one who shows up no matter what. But beneath the surface, something is accumulating. They notice their own stories get interrupted, their own struggles dismissed. They realize certain friends only reach out when they need something. They start feeling more like an emotional service provider than an actual friend. Then comes the breaking point. The transformation is total. They stop responding to messages. They cancel plans without explanation. They simply vanish. When concerned friends eventually reach out, they receive polite but cold responses that make clear the old dynamic is over. The empath has become a ghost, unreachable behind walls of ice. What Jung would recognize is that this person isn't being cruel. They're being protected by their unconscious. The psyche has determined that these relationships were parasitic and has severed the connections with ruthless efficiency. They've entered their nigredo, and the old relational patterns had to die completely for something new to eventually emerge. Third scenario, the family empath who establishes absolute boundaries. Think about someone who has been the emotional caretaker of their family system for decades. They're the one who smooths over conflicts, remembers birthdays, listens to each family member complain about the others. They've absorbed everyone's anxiety, disappointment, and resentment. Then something catalyzes the change. The transformation is dramatic. They announce boundaries that feel shocking to the family system. They won't attend certain gatherings, won't discuss particular topics, won't mediate conflicts anymore. The family experiences this as betrayal. The family system mobilizes to force them back using guilt, shame, and accusations. But the boundaries hold because they're not really the individual's conscious choice. They're the unconscious refusing to participate in the familiar destruction. What Jung understood is that the family is where we first develop our relational templates, where the seeds of over-empathy are often planted. The cold empath is enacting what Jung called separation from the parents, not just physical parents, but the parental complexes that have colonized their psyche. This separation is absolutely necessary for individuation. These three scenarios reveal the social and relational consequences of the empath's transformation. When an empath turns cold, it sends shockwaves through their entire social ecosystem, because so many people had unconsciously organized their own psychology around the empath's availability. Now, after everything we've explored, you're probably wondering about practical application. How do you navigate this territory? This is where Jung's work on active integration becomes essential. The framework I'm about to share isn't about returning to naive empathy or staying in the cold phase permanently. What we're aiming for is what Jung called the reconciliation of opposites, a third position that transcends the binary. This integrated position requires conscious work, but it's the only path to genuine psychological wholeness. The first critical step involves what Jung termed shadow work, consciously examining the aspects of yourself that drove the over-empathetic patterns. This requires brutal honesty about your motivations. Were you genuinely compassionate, or were you unconsciously trying to control relationships by making yourself indispensable? Was your empathy authentic connection, or was it a strategy for earning love and belonging? These questions aren't meant to shame you. The unconscious patterns that drove your excessive empathy developed for reasons, often as survival strategies in childhood. But bringing these patterns into awareness is the first step toward having actual choice about how you relate to others and yourself. The second element involves learning to distinguish between authentic feeling versus feeling contaminated by unconscious complexes. Not all empathy is healthy empathy. Sometimes what we experience as compassion is actually our own unprocessed pain being triggered and projected outward. True empathy comes from a place of psychological stability, not from desperate attempts to heal ourselves through healing others. The third component involves establishing what Jung understood as appropriate boundaries, not the rigid walls of the cold phase, but permeable membranes that allow genuine connection while protecting your psychological integrity. This means learning to say no without guilt, to prioritize your own needs without shame. For someone who has been an over-empathetic people-pleaser, these practices feel terrifying at first, but actually you're becoming psychologically healthy. Jung emphasized that individuation requires developing all four psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. The empath who collapsed into coldness was over-identified with feeling and had to develop thinking. But the goal isn't to remain stuck in thinking, it's to have access to both. Psychological health means having the full range available, rather than being trapped at either extreme. The fourth element involves what Jung called withdrawing projections, recognizing that people in your life are not your responsibility to fix, save, or manage emotionally. This is perhaps the hardest work, because it requires accepting your fundamental limitations. You cannot heal anyone else's psychology. Real love sometimes means allowing people to struggle with their own darkness, rather than constantly illuminating it for them. The fifth component requires examining your relationship with solitude and internal resources. The empath who turned cold often did so because they had no internal anchor, no stable sense of self that existed independent of their relational identity. The coldness forcibly creates this center through isolation, but conscious integration requires developing it intentionally, cultivating a rich internal life, building genuine self-knowledge. Jung's concept of the self, the organizing center of the psyche that transcends ego identity, becomes crucial here. The integrated individual has a relationship with something deeper than their social persona or relational roles. This internal anchor prevents both the excessive empathy that leads to collapse and the defensive coldness that prevents genuine connection. Here's what I need you to understand. Jung's warning about the empath who turns cold isn't a cautionary tale about what to avoid. It's a description of a necessary psychological process that many people must undergo to achieve genuine wholeness. The coldness isn't the problem. It's a symptom of the deeper imbalance that preceded it. If you're currently in the cold phase, your task isn't to force yourself back into compassion before your psyche is ready. It's to use this time wisely, to examine what led you here, to develop the boundaries you lacked before, to build genuine self-knowledge. The coldness is temporary if you work with it consciously. If you're emerging from the coldness, you're entering the most delicate phase. This is where you must consciously hold the tension Jung described. You now have access to both poles, the empathetic connection and the protective boundaries. The work is learning to move fluidly between them based on what each situation genuinely requires. If you're recognizing the early warning signs, you have the opportunity to do what Jung called conscious suffering, choosing to address the imbalance before the unconscious forces correction through crisis. This means voluntarily establishing boundaries, deliberately disappointing people who expect endless availability. Yes, this is uncomfortable, but conscious discomfort is vastly preferable to the psychological emergency of complete emotional shutdown. The people in your life will have varied reactions to your integration work. Some will respect your boundaries and evolve with you. These are your genuine relationships worth preserving. Others will resist or withdraw when you're no longer playing your assigned role. These relationships were never authentic, and losing them is necessary for your psychological health. What strikes me most about Jung's work is his refusal to offer easy comfort. He understood that individuation, becoming who you actually are rather than who others need you to be, is possibly the most difficult psychological work a human can undertake. But he also understood it was the only work that ultimately mattered. The empath's journey through coldness and toward integration mirrors the fundamental human journey from unconscious identification with collective expectations toward conscious, authentic selfhood. Jung saw this pattern repeat throughout human history. The compassionate figure who must descend into darkness before emerging, transformed. This is an archetypal pattern that transcends individual psychology. This perspective doesn't minimize your suffering, but it does give it context and meaning. Jung believed that suffering we can understand as part of a larger pattern, a necessary stage in a transformative process, becomes something we can work with, rather than simply endure. The cold phase isn't punishment for caring too much. It's initiation into a deeper level of psychological maturity. Integrating these insights requires ongoing practice, not a one-time revelation. You'll face situations that trigger the old compulsion to overgive. You'll encounter people who try to guilt you back into your former role. These are the tests Jung described, opportunities to consciously choose your integrated position rather than defaulting to either extreme. What you've absorbed here represents years of Jungian study condensed into applicable insights. Most people go their entire lives cycling between empathetic burnout and defensive coldness, without ever understanding the deeper patterns at work. But you now have access to a different path. The question Jung would ask you now is direct. Will you bring consciousness to this process, or will you remain unconscious and let the patterns continue cycling? Will you do the difficult work of examining your shadow motivations, establishing genuine boundaries, developing internal resources, and integrating both poles of your emotional capacity? I've given you the map Jung created through decades of careful observation and clinical wisdom. I've shown you the warning signs, the stages of transformation, the integration framework. But understanding isn't transformation. Knowledge isn't integration. You have to actually apply this, practice it, live it through the inevitable discomfort and resistance you'll encounter. If these insights resonated with you, if you recognized yourself or patterns in your life, then your psyche is ready for this work. The unconscious brought you to this understanding because you're at a threshold. The question is whether you'll cross it consciously or whether you'll wait until crisis forces you through it. Take what you've learned here and sit with it. Notice over the coming days what triggers your empathetic compulsions. Observe when you start sacrificing your boundaries. Pay attention to the resentment that accumulates when you give beyond your genuine capacity. These are the warning signs Jung taught us to recognize. Remember that integration isn't a destination you reach and then you're done. It's an ongoing practice of holding the tension between opposites, of choosing consciously rather than reacting unconsciously, of honoring both your capacity for connection and your need for boundaries. Jung spent his life exploring these depths because he believed psychological consciousness was humanity's greatest achievement and responsibility. His entire body of work was an invitation to wake up, to see what's actually driving us, to bring light into the psychological darkness where our real motivations and patterns hide. The warning about the empath who turns cold is ultimately an invitation to consciousness before crisis forces it upon you. It's a call to examine your empathy, to question your motivations, to establish boundaries before your psyche establishes them violently through shutdown. You've invested this time, this attention, this willingness to look at uncomfortable psychological truths. Don't let these insights become just interesting information. Let them become active principles that guide your choices, your boundaries, your relationships, your entire approach to how you move through the world. The journey from unconscious empathy through necessary coldness toward conscious integration is one of the most profound transformations a human psyche can undergo. You now understand this journey in ways most people never will. The question is what you'll do with that understanding. Your psyche is always listening, always working, always moving toward balance. The unconscious will have its way eventually. The only question is whether you'll participate consciously or be dragged through the process unconsciously. Jung gave us the tools to choose consciousness. What you do with them from here determines whether this was just information or actual transformation.